Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're talking to Joseph Thatcher from Clifton Park in our area. He's written a very interesting book. It's called The Confederate Coal Torpedo, a little known incident in the Civil War, or more than one incident. And the subtitle is Thomas Courtney's Infernal Sabotage Weapon. So welcome, Joe. Thanks for coming down.
Thank you.
Now you're obviously interested in history, and this story goes back since you were a kid, you were telling me. But before we start, just want to mention a little bit. For over 20 years, you were the chief of collections and the supervising curator down at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation. Mm-hmm. That is the office that oversees 30 or 40 historic sites?
About 35, 36 state historic sites.
In New York State?
New York State.
And what did you... The job of the curator, what was that job involve?
Well, I worked with the collections at all these different historic sites.
Okay.
I worked on exhibit scripts, worked on putting exhibits together.
So like when you went to one of these, like the General Herkimer House or the Oriskany Battlefield, mm-hmm. the things that you read when you're standing, you wrote some of them?
I wrote a lot of those.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What were some of the ones?
A lot of work done at Fort Ontario out in Oswego,
right.
Sackett's Harbor. The only 1812 naval site in New York State.
Oh, good. So you're obviously interested in history. So you were telling me before we started the story of the Confederate Coal Torpedo. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this book, I should say one other thing for people watching. This book came out in 2011. It's the first book about this I don't know, it's a situation or incident or whatever. But you said you've been living with this story since you were a kid. So how did this all start? And what is... I have one right here. We'll talk about it when we get going. But what is the Confederate Coal Torpedo, and how did you get involved with this?
Well, it's a sabotage weapon
designed
to take the Confederate attack outside the boundaries of the Confederacy to the Union's forces. It's an explosive device. It was shaped, iron casting made to look like coal, filled with gunpowder. Could be hidden in coal piles for the Union ships. And when it was shoveled into the fire under the boiler, it would blow up, rupture the boiler, scatter burning coals out of the firebox, and set the ship on fire usually.
And it was, from skimming through your book here, it was successful several times during the end of the Civil War?
Yeah, we know of several vessels definitely sunk or damaged severely by the torpedo. There are others that were probably done, but because they were considered boiler explosions, it's hard to determine.
It's hard to tell, okay. Well, then why don't we start with your involvement? Why don't we start with who was Thomas Courtney? And like I said, you've been living with this since you were a kid. So how did this all come about? I think obviously there's a personal connection here.
Well, Thomas Courtney was my great-great-grandfather. And from the time I was probably 12 or 13 years old, I was aware that the family had this collection of documents and papers. And I was interested in the Civil War like everybody, kid that age, starts
Well, you
out.
only knew him as great-grandfather.
I knew him as great-great-grandfather.
Okay.
And my grandmother, who lived with us, had known his wife. He had died before she was born, obviously, but she had known his wife. And always thought he was a little bit shady because he had lost most of his money and the family had been in bad straits. And as we got into the papers, began to put this story together, and I think she felt somewhat vindicated that he was not quite as bad as she thought he was. But I grew up, started the papers. I wrote the first article about them in 1960 for a military historian's journal. But we knew very little about the details. We just knew the rough substance.
But up until 1960, Civil War aficionados or historians, they knew of this coal torpedo.
Yeah, there were mentions of the coal torpedo.
Of it, But there was never really a lot of research done.
Never much research, partly because I have the only collection of his documents that survive.
Okay.
And it was credited sometimes to Gabriel Rains, who was head of the Confederate Torpedo Bureau, but he had nothing to do with this.
Okay.
Courtney had his own independent Secret Service corps.
So by 1960, you were obviously a working historian with your job before New York State, but you've always kept this interest. So how did you finally, what gave you the impetus to finally tell the story?
Well, I had put some of the material together, and then I went into the Air Force after college, went to graduate school here in Cooperstown, actually. Went back to Ohio, worked in a museum there for 10 years. Started a family, ended up moving to New York, and I didn't have a lot of time to get involved in it. And
Well, you kept the papers with you, which we'll show on the screen as we're talking.
Yes.
You kept the
yeah,
papers.
kept the documents.
So
kept
you
the
sort of
papers.
knew the story.
Yeah, it was
the
there.
story that
It was
hadn't been told.
It was there waiting for me to have time to do something with it. And in 1999, my son and I had started doing some more in-depth research. And I learned that there was an example of the coal torpedo up in Canada. We were contacted by a man on the internet who had read some of our stuff. And he brought them down to, he had two, and he brought them down to Albany, and I got to see them. And 4 years later, I was able to negotiate a deal with him and get one.
And is this the one right here?
This is the one.
All right, I'll show this. It actually looks and feels like a lump of coal. It's got a little plug here, and obviously
Yeah, it was hollow,
it was hollowed out.
iron casting. They used real pieces of coal
Okay.
as the patterns, filled them with gunpowder, put the plug in, and then covered them with pitch and beeswax, and then dipped them in bits of coal dust. So it looked like a piece of coal, and it would be hidden in the coal piles.
Okay, now, when you're saying it had to be hidden, the Confederate Secret Service, I always forget that there was Secret Service and spies and all that, even in the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
The Confederate Secret Service would go about, what?
Courtney was authorized to enlist 25 men to plant these devices anywhere and everywhere they could. And his arrangement with the Confederate government was he would pay the men. The government would give him the castings and the gunpowder, and he would be reimbursed 50% of the value of property damaged, federal property damaged. He was to be reimbursed in Confederate bonds.
Oh, you
which
mean
was
like
a big
sort of
mistake.
as a reward or something?
Well, as the payment.
Oh, okay.
He was a captain, but he was a volunteer captain for General Sterling Price in Arkansas, and he refused a regular Confederate commission. He wanted to stay as the volunteer captain. So his deal was, I'll pay the men, you pay me back for all the damage we cause. But he did it in Confederate bonds, which was not the smartest thing to do.
Okay. Now, he had a sort of, before we could back up just a little bit, Thomas Courtney had kind of an interesting life before he joined the Confederates, and I guess there was a reason. What were some of the reasons he sort of went to their side, I guess you could say?
Well, he was the son of an Englishman living in Ireland, youngest son of 7 children. And his father died when he was 10 years old. He was born in 1822. His father died in 1832 when he was 10 years old. And by 1842, he was looking for work. His older brothers had already come to this country, 2 of them at least. And so he determined to come here, get together with these older brothers and try to make a fortune here. So he came over in 1842, landed at New Orleans, and met his older brother, and then went up to Vicksburg to live with the other brother briefly, and ended up finally in St. Louis. And he had established a marine and fire insurance company, and very successful. But in 1860, he was appointed sheriff of St. Louis County to fill out an unexpired term of the sheriff who died in office. And his chief deputy, who ran the office basically, ended up embezzling about $30,000. Courtney pledged all of his own assets to cover that while he sued the deputy. The Civil War started within the next year, and the lawsuit kind of went on hold. And he had no money; he had nothing to do. But he also was very upset with actions of the Lincoln government. He thought it was undemocratic. It was un-British.
Now, was he involved in politics or anything?
He was involved in local politics
Okay.
in St. Louis, certainly.
But he disagreed with some of Lincoln's policies before the Civil War.
Just as at the beginning of the war, the suspension of habeas corpus, the sinking of a stone fleet of ships to try to blockade Charleston Harbor,
Okay.
the arrest of the two British ambassadors going to England, Mason and Slidell, who were stopped by the U.S. Navy on the high seas, and a number of other off and on things that just bothered him so much that he ended up going to the fight for the
Okay.
Confederacy.
Well, then, instead of just going and joining the Confederates, how did he come up with the idea of not just being a soldier, this whole thing of this clandestine activity and all this?
He joined Sterling Price, who was general commanding troops in the Department of Arkansas.
Okay. Yeah.
And Price had a group of people called boat burners that were trying to set fires on Union steamers on the rivers. And Courtney realized that setting fires that way was kind of dangerous.
They would just
So-
try to go to the boat and just try to set it on fire and anything.
Yeah, try to
Okay, all right.
sabotage it with a fire. So he came up with an idea of taking pieces of log cordwood for the fire boxes, drilling them out and stuffing them with gunpowder and then hiding them in the wood piles.
Okay.
And as he did that, it worked, but he realized that the Federal Navy vessels mostly burn coal. So he came up with the idea of a coal version and wrote to Jefferson Davis, took the idea to Richmond, and Davis thought it was a wonderful idea.
I mean, I have to say, it does seem kind of ingenious. I mean,
Oh, yeah. The Confederacy had very limited resources because they didn't have the industrial base that the North did. And this was a way, Courtney felt, I think, that they could take the war outside the borders of the Confederacy to the Federals. Because these would work for shipping, they would work for steam-powered machinery in a factory.
And then how were they, I think this is where the Secret Service comes in, how were they snuck on? I mean, they didn't just put them in the coal, you can't just go drop them in the coal bin. How did they get sort of on the...
You put them in the coal yards. When you see pictures of coal supply yards for the Union Navy during the Civil War, they're the size, football long and football field long and football field wide.
But they would still have to sneak in and...
But they weren't well guarded.
Like you could literally just throw some
Yeah,
coal.
walk by and just drop it in the pile.
All right.
Drop however many you could in a pile. You could carry them in a coat pocket or carry them in a bag.
Okay.
And security in those days was very different than today. I mean, we think of military security or the White House security as very tough. But you could walk into the White House, walk down the hall, and try to see President Lincoln as he's on his way to his office.
And just walk in.
Walk in.
I've read things like that.
Yeah.
But the coal. So, how many? All right, say you got coal in there. Would if one of these blew up in the boiler, would that be all it would take, or was? I mean,
It could be. All you had to do was to rupture the boiler, which is already under pressure,
okay.
and the firebox underneath the boiler. When these explode, the burning coals in the firebox are thrown out and scattered around the fire room floor. So you've got scalding steam, you've got fire on the floor, which set the vessels on fire. The one instance that we know of for sure, General Benjamin Butler's vessel, the Greyhound, one of these went off. The vessel caught fire, burned to the waterline. Butler and the people on board got off, but his horses went down with the vessel. And that torpedo was carried on board with, they think, by a group of agents, because there was so little security that they saw this group of rough-looking fellows, they called them.
Yeah.
They stopped and put them off, and a few miles later, down the river, up it went.
Now, I think I mentioned, I don't know if it was in the book or I was reading something on the internet about your book. Did they finally catch on after a while that there was a possibility of the coal? Because I think there was an order, something about they started guarding the coal yards more.
Well, they tried to, but they actually knew about them. Federal Navy knew about them even before Courtney was authorized to actually put them into operation.
Okay.
But they didn't want to panic people, and they didn't have enough resources that they were willing to divert to guard every coal pile, every wood yard around.
No less every piece of coal. I mean, obviously this plug thing here would have been covered up.
Would have covered up.
Okay.
And one of the vessels that was severely damaged by a coal torpedo was a gunboat Shenango, newly built in New York Navy Yard. It was sailing out of the Navy Yard on its maiden voyage when the boiler exploded. And although it was didn't burn, it was out of action for almost a year. And Gideon Welles, who was Secretary of the Navy, wrote in his diary, "I fear it is one of the Confederate coal shells." But the official cause was listed as a faulty boiler installation. And the second engineer of the vessel was cashiered out of the Navy. This was in 1864. 2 or 3 years later, he was very quietly reinstated in the Navy with a promotion. So they didn't want people to know that they were able to get one of these or more of these devices into the coal supply in New York Harbor.
Okay, now if it didn't go to a ship, and say it just happened to be, was the coal only used for ships? What if by some quirk it was in someone's house? Would it just blown up right in your fireplace? Or?
Could, yeah. In fact, they issued with these a separate plug that had a hole in the center that you could put a fuse in and literally make a bomb out of it.
Okay.
And one of those was found under a stairway in the Springfield Arsenal building in Springfield, Massachusetts in December of 1864 in an attempt to blow up the Arsenal building. And it was planted probably by 2 agents out of Canada who were dressed up like women. And the watchman let them into the building and they planted this.
That one always works. So how many, do they know, how many ships were sunk or damaged? Do they know, or they can only guess?
They can only guess. We know, Courtney himself claimed in a letter to a friend in England that they had sunk the Shenango or damaged it, and a great many other steamers on the rivers, he said. And we think there are probably half a dozen or more that were very likely the coal torpedo or the wooden version. But because it mimicked a boiler explosion, it's very hard to tell.
Well, I mean, boiler explosions in and of them are not uncommon anyway. I mean,
and Courtney, of course, knew all. That's one of the reasons he came up with the idea, because in his marine and fire insurance business, he knew about the hazards of boilers and steamboats.
So you could never tell. I mean, I know from reading Mark Twain, the boiler explosion, like always described as like this horrific, you know.
And he would have claimed a number of vessels and been reimbursed for them because he had a number of Confederate bonds with him when he went to England at the end of the war. And he sold some of them. We know of at least one group of bonds that were sold for him. So he was paid for more than just the 1 or 2 vessels that we know of right now today.
So going back to 1999, obviously you were maybe getting close to retirement from the state. You had all the documents. So what was how did you finally, sort of get it all together?
Well, I had put a lot of the information together, and I was down in Virginia at a cousin of my wife's, and their next door neighbor had written a number of books for the Naval Institute Press.
Okay.
And I took all my material over and showed it to Dr. Tucker, and he said, "Oh, definitely you have a book here. You've got to write the book." So I said, "Okay, I guess I will." And came back and started writing, and I probably wrote the book in about a little less than a year.
Okay, and I should say to people, we have a copy here at the library, profusely illustrated, as they say. There's a lot of pictures, not just of people, but people and places. Nice glossy paper, but a lot of actual photographs from from Civil War times. Here's some pictures of the coal, or different. Whoops, get that on there. Different types of bombs. I mean, it was obviously different kinds of shapes. So what? And that did it surprise you that this incident or these incidences weren't written about yet, or no one had written about the coal torpedo yet? It was only known to historians?
No, not really, because the documents didn't exist except in my collection. These were papers that he kept himself, and all of the Confederate Secret Service records were burned at the end of the war.
All right.
And so nobody had access to most of them. There were a couple of them in the official records, but everything else is I have.
All right, so now it's all right. Now I think I'm getting it. It was sort of a secret thing, so that's why when all the papers were destroyed, it wasn't really known. Okay. So.
But the interesting thing about it at the end was that the idea was reinvigorated during World War II.
I was going to say that Thomas Courtney had his post-Civil War where he tried to sell this idea.
He tried to sell them to foreign governments without any success.
As an idea for them to use, and
Yeah.
okay.
But
Why wouldn't they have wanted that idea? It seemed like it worked. I mean,
well, they were already being superseded by the so-called fish torpedoes or self-propelled real torpedoes and longer range gunfire, and it just was not as practical.
And then coal burning ended out. When did coal burning ships end?
Well, not until World War I and after.
So.
But during World War II, the Germans, the American OSS, and the Japanese all did versions of the same thing using plastic explosive. So
The same, what do you mean the same?
made coal shapes out of plastic explosive with a detonator and hid them in coal piles.
All right,
For railroads, in particular for railroads.
Really?
We had a story that I couldn't confirm about a man in Europe during the end of the war who had trouble with locomotives that the American Army was using blowing up. And they finally discovered that a German woman was pedaling along the road next to the rail yard and throwing these German versions over the fence into the coal tenders for locomotives.
And did any? This is during World War II in America. Did any locomotives blow up? Or?
No, these were in Germany.
Oh, I'm sorry, in Germany.
But the German agents who landed on Long Island in 1942 under Operation Pastorius had plastic explosive coal bombs with them
to try and
use in this country.
And oh wow.
I like to think that Thomas Courtney would be sort of pleased that his idea survived.
Well, you were telling me this one here you have. This is only one of what, 4 that are left,
There
or
are
4 that are known.
4 known right now.
Okay.
When I wrote the book, there were only 3 known.
Okay, and then what was the one in Springfield? Is that the next one that was?
No, one in Springfield disappeared.
Oh, okay.
Nobody knows where it is. But there is mine. There's one still in Canada, part of a group that Canadian Confederate agents operating out of Canada were using. One in Bennington, Vermont, in the museum there, and that one was found on Jefferson Davis's desk at the end of the war as a production sample, and he kept it all through the war on his desk. And the 4th one just turned up last year underwater in a river in Alabama.
Really? Okay. Well, Thomas Courtney, unfortunately, I read a little bit about his life here. He sort of had a sad ending.
Yes.
So after trying to sell his idea that didn't take, he had Confederate war bonds that were worth nothing.
Yeah.
So how did he? It sounds like the last several years of his life were sort of. Well, how did he end?
Well, he came back to this country in 1868, and he tried to establish an insurance business again, and he did some of that in New York and in Baltimore, but he was not in really good health, and very depressed because he was scraping to keep his family together, and he went to Virginia, Jordan Springs, Virginia, in 1875 to take the healing waters, like going to Saratoga, and had a stroke there and died. And his son, who was a young Methodist preacher at that point in Winchester, Virginia, discovered that his father had pawned the papers and the family portraits, silver, to keep the family going. So he raised $100, which was a lot of money in 1875, and got the portraits and the papers out of pawn. And when he died in 1938, my mother and grandmother were cleaning out the house in Ohio that he lived in, and there was a bundle marked Father's Papers.
Okay, and then that's when you became.
That's when we got into them.
All right. Do you think that going through these papers as a kid made your interest in history, becoming a historian?
Oh, it certainly helped.
Contributed.
It certainly helped.
So, what has been the reaction among the Civil War people or Civil War aficionados who are legion in the country? What's been the reaction to the book so far?
Well, so far the people that have responded back to me who've purchased it, either from the publisher or from me, has been very positive. We've had 2 very good reviews in Civil War News and Civil War Times magazine.
Okay.
And so I've had fun selling. I sell autographed copies.
Okay.
And I've had fun. I've gotten to meet a lot of interesting people, done a lot of interesting things.
And you've spoken in a lot of different places about the book, not just in New York State, but
mostly in New York.
okay.
But it's been a lot of fun.
No, that's good. Now, we're filming this here on September 19th, I think. You're telling me you're going to be on the History Channel this winter sometime. We don't know the date yet, but the television show, The History Detectives,
Which is on PBS.
is on. Yes, it is a
PBS.
PBS show. That's right. All right, I'm thinking of a different show. The PBS show, History Detectives. You're going to be on. The focus of the show is the sinking of
The steamer Sultana.
the steamer Sultana, and one of the theories is how did that all come about, being on the History Detectives?
Well, the Sultana story, which is a very sad one, it was bringing back a huge load of former prisoners of war from Andersonville, Union prisoners of war. And
I mean, it was something like over 1,000.
oh yeah, there were well over 1,000, almost 1,700 that died on it. Boiler exploded, it caught fire, it burned, and everybody blamed it on a patched boiler and overloaded vessel.
Well, I mean, the
for years.
Sultana incident is what the show they're
Show
going
is
to be
all about.
investigating, and then okay.
And one of the theories, which was located by a family, people doing research in St. Louis history, was that a former Confederate boat burner, mail runner named Robert Loudon, who confessed in 1868 to a friend that he had put one of these on board the Sultana.
Okay.
And so there is controversy back and forth. Was it one of these? Was it the boiler? We'll never know for sure, but it's certainly very possible. And the description of what happened to the Sultana is typical of one of these acting. The woman who wrote the article and outed Robert Loudon,
Yeah.
so to speak, had used some of my information in her article, and she told the History Detective people they had to go and see me because I had all of the Courtney material in the torpedo.
But how many theories are the sinking? Are there just those two?
The two, basically, yes.
Now, what do you think, or is it possible?
Oh, I think it's very possible.
I mean, you have a deathbed confession, I think.
Yeah, basically a deathbed confession. And the story didn't come out then until 1888. The Sultana story happened just a couple of days before Lincoln's assassination.
Okay.
So it went immediately to page 14 in the papers, you know. And there was a reunion in 1888, and the man in St. Louis who knew the story was interviewed by a newspaper person who said, "Do you know anything about the Sultana?" "Oh, yes, I know who put a coal torpedo on board."
Okay. Well, unlike our show here, for the PBS the History Detectives, you said it's an hour show, right?
It's an hour show.
And you said tell us a little bit about that. They filmed you for like 8 hours or something?
They were at our house. They were at our house in Clifton Park for 8 hours.
All right. So
a crew of 5 and the talent.
Okay. So obviously you don't know how they're going to edit it down, but you gave a little history of the coal torpedo and Thomas Courtney and how it possibly could have. Okay. So.
And they looked at some of the original documents as well.
Okay. So that'll be on this winter on PBS History Detectives, so people have to watch for that. Well, Joe, thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. There's a really fascinating story
Thank you,
here
Joe.
of the Confederate Coal Torpedo, Thomas Courtney's infernal sabotage weapon, and we will see you next time on Meet the Author.